The salty breeze danced through the air as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The rhythmic crash of waves against the shore was a familiar lullaby to Isabella. The daughter of a humble fisherman, she had spent her entire life by the sea, helping her father mend nets, clean fish, and sometimes, when the catch was light, staring out at the endless ocean, wondering what lay beyond. Life was simple, but tough. Every morning before dawn, her father would sail out, hoping to bring back enough fish to sell at the market, and every evening, Isabella would wait for him by the dock, her bare feet sinking into the cool, damp sand. But this evening was different. There was an eerie stillness in the air, a strange hush that made the hair on the back of her neck rise. As she walked along the shore, her toes brushing against seaweed and broken shells, she spotted something unusual near the waterline. At first, it looked like driftwood, dark and still. But as she moved closer, her breath hitched in her throat. It wasn't driftwood. It was a man. He lay motionless on the sand, his clothes soaked, his body half buried in the wet shore. His face was pale, his expensive-looking shirt clinging to his chest, and his fingers twitched slightly as a wave lapped over his legs. Isabella's heart pounded. Who was he? Where had he come from? Was he even alive? She dropped to her knees, beside him, her hands trembling as she reached for his wrist. A pulse, faint but there. Relief washed over her, but it was quickly replaced by urgency. She shook his shoulder gently. The man didn't respond. His eyelids fluttered slightly, but his breathing was shallow, his body limp against the cold sand. Isabella's pulse quickened. She had never seen someone like him before. His clothes were far too expensive for a fisherman, and the silver watch on his wrist gleamed even under the fading light. Whoever he was, he didn't belong here. But that didn't matter now. He needed help. She glanced around. The shore was empty, the boats in the distance bobbing gently with the tide. Her father was still out at sea, and the nearest village was too far to run for help. Gritting her teeth, Isabella hooked her arms under his and began to drag him away from the waves. The effort made her muscles burn, but she didn't stop until she had pulled him onto dry sand. "Hey," she tried again, gently patting his cheek. "Can you hear me?" A low groan escaped his lips. His fingers twitched, and after a long pause, his eyes fluttered open. For a moment, he looked dazed, confused, as if trying to remember where he was. His gaze darted to her, filled with unspoken questions. But before he could say anything, his body sagged, and his eyes shut again. Panic coiled in Isabella's stomach. He was alive, but he was weak. She had no idea what had happened to him, but leaving him here wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, she stood and grabbed him by the arms once more, dragging him toward her small wooden shack just beyond the dunes. By the time she got him inside, sweat beaded on her forehead. She laid him on a makeshift bed, a pile of blankets near the fire, and hurried to fetch water. When she returned, she saw him shifting slightly. His brow creased as though he were fighting against the weight of unconsciousness. Carefully, she pressed the cup to his lips, letting a few drops of water wet his mouth. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a shuddering breath, he opened his eyes again. This time, they stayed open. "Where?" His voice was hoarse, barely a whisper. "Where am I?" "You're safe," Isabella assured him. "I found you on the shore. Do you remember what happened?" He blinked sluggishly, as though the effort of thinking was painful. His eyes, a deep, stormy grey, flickered with confusion. Then, suddenly something changed. A flash of fear, a flicker of urgency. I was on a boat," he murmured. "There was a storm. I think someone He trailed off, his gaze unfocused, as if his mind was piecing together a puzzle with missing pieces. Isabella frowned. A storm. That didn't make sense. The waters had been calm all day. And what did he mean by someone? Had he been with others? Was anyone with you? She asked carefully. He exhaled sharply, his fingers clenching into weak fists. I don't know, I can't remember. Isabella studied him. There was something about the way he said it that made her uneasy. He wasn't just confused, he was afraid. For the next few minutes, she helped him drink more water, watching as the color slowly returned to his face. He still looked pale, exhausted. But at least he was awake. What's your name? She asked softly. There was a long pause. Then, hesitantly, he said, Nathan. It was the first thing he seemed sure of. Isabella nodded. I'm Isabella. Nathan swallowed hard, his gaze drifting around the small shack. It was modest, nothing more than wooden walls and a roof patched up with old fishing nets. But it was warm, safe. His jaw tightened slightly, and Isabella could tell he was trying to make sense of everything. What were you doing on the boat? She pressed. Another pause. He hesitated, then murmured, I don't know. Isabella narrowed her eyes. She could tell when someone was lying. But before she could push further, a loud voice cut through the night. Isabella! Her heart leaped. It was her father. She rushed to the door, stepping out into the cool night air. He was trudging up the sandy path, carrying a net over his shoulder, his expression weary but relieved to be home. You're late, she said, trying to steady her breath. The sea was quiet tonight, he replied, brushing past her into the shack. But the moment he stepped inside, he froze. His eyes landed on Nathan, still lying weakly on the blankets, and his expression darkened. Who is this? He asked, his voice firm. Isabella swallowed. I found him on the shore. He was unconscious. You brought a stranger into our home? Her father cut in, his face tight with worry. Isabella, you don't know who he is. I couldn't leave him there, she insisted. He would have died. Her father exhaled sharply, setting down his net. His gaze flickered between Isabella and Nathan, suspicion clear in his eyes. Then finally, he sighed and crouched down beside the stranger. Nathan, sensing the tension, shifted slightly. I don't mean any harm, he murmured weakly. Her father studied him for a long moment before finally nodding. You should rest. We'll talk in the morning. Isabella let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. But as she glanced at Nathan, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. He was hiding something. And whatever it was, she had a sinking feeling that it was only the beginning. That night, Isabella couldn't sleep. The small room was quiet, except for the rhythmic sound of waves crashing in the distance. But inside her head, everything was loud. She kept thinking about Nathan, about his fear, his confusion, the way he hesitated when she asked about the boat. Something about his story didn't add up. She turned over on her makeshift bed, glancing toward where Nathan lay. He was asleep, his breathing steady but uneasy, as if his body was resting, but his mind was still running. Her father had agreed to let him stay the night, but Isabella knew he wasn't happy about it. He had warned her before about trusting strangers, especially ones who washed up on shore with no explanation. But still, she couldn't shake the feeling that Nathan needed her help. As the first light of dawn peeked through the cracks in the wooden walls, Isabella stirred. Her father had already left to check on the boats, and Nathan was still asleep. She quietly got up, stepping outside to fetch some water. But as she reached for the bucket, she heard something behind her. Footsteps. She turned sharply, only to see Nathan standing in the doorway. He looked stronger now, though his face was still pale. His eyes clouded with something between exhaustion and determination. "You should be resting," she said, setting the bucket down. Nathan hesitated. "I need to leave." Isabella frowned. "You're still weak. Where would you even go?" He ran a hand through his damp hair, exhaling slowly. "I remember what happened," he admitted. "I wasn't alone on that boat. Someone tried to kill me." A chill ran down Isabella's spine. Nathan met her eyes. "I was supposed to meet someone, a business partner, but I was set up. I don't know who did it, but they wanted me dead." He swallowed hard. "I think they threw me overboard, expecting the sea to take care of the rest." The weight of his words settled between them. Isabella's heart pounded. If someone had tried to kill him, that meant they might still be looking for him. And if they found him here, "You're saying someone could come after you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Nathan nodded. "If they know I survived, yes." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, suddenly, in the distance, a sound broke the morning stillness, the low hum of an engine. Isabella's stomach dropped. There was only one road leading to their shack, and barely anyone ever came this way. But now, a black SUV was kicking up dust as it approached. Nathan's jaw clenched. "It's them." Isabella's mind raced. There was no time to think. "Come with me," she whispered, grabbing his hand. Without waiting for a response, she pulled him toward the back of the shack, leading him down a hidden path that twisted through the dunes. They moved quickly, their feet sinking into the soft sand, hearts pounding as the sound of the approaching car grew louder. They didn't stop until they reached the old fishing dock, where her father's extra boat was tied. Isabella scrambled aboard, gesturing for Nathan to do the same. "Get in," she urged. "We'll take the boat. They won't be able to follow us on the water." Nathan hesitated for only a second before climbing in. Isabella untied the ropes, her hands shaking as she pushed them away from the shore. The engine sputtered to life, and within moments, they were moving, cutting across the water just as the SUV came into view in the distance. Nathan turned back, watching as two men stepped out of the car, scanning the area. "They know I'm alive," he muttered. Isabella's grip on the steering wheel tightened. "Then we make sure they don't find you." For what felt like hours, they stayed on the water, heading toward a nearby fishing village, where Isabella knew they could find safety. Nathan was silent for most of the trip, staring out at the endless horizon, lost in thought. Finally he turned to her. "You saved my life. Twice." Isabella gave him a small smile. "I couldn't just leave you." A flicker of something crossed his face. Gratitude, relief, maybe even something deeper. "I won't forget this," he said firmly. "And when I figure out who did this, I'll make sure they don't hurt anyone else." She believed him. By the time they reached the village, the sun had risen high in the sky. Isabella pulled the boat into the dock, turning to Nathan one last time. "What will you do now?" He exhaled slowly. "Disappear for a while. Find out the truth." Then, after a pause, he looked at her. "You should come with me." Isabella blinked, taken aback. "Me? You're the only person I trust," he admitted. "And, I don't know, maybe you've spent too long in one place." For a moment, she hesitated. She had spent her whole life by the sea, helping her father, living a simple life. But for the first time, she felt like maybe there was something more, waiting for her out there. She glanced at the water, then back at Nathan. Maybe it was time to find out.